There are times in our lives when our paths intersect with individuals that have bad intentions. For many, they find out too late. For others, they discover if they had taken a wrong turn, been all alone, or been the chosen lucky one, they would have been the next victim of a psychopath. Here are 7 stories people told where luck was on their side. Enjoy. Back in the 70s, my grandfather dropped my grandmother, mom, and her 2 sisters off to do some shopping on his way to work. Since he wasn't able to pick them up, they hitchhiked home. My mom at the time was only around 10 or 11. Her middle sister would have been around 7 or 8, and the youngest was about a year old. They get picked up by a guy in a pickup truck who has them all sit in the back row, with one of them holding the baby. My grandmother was giving directions to their home from the highway, but the guy ignored her and went by their exit, claiming he had to make a stop first. Didn't really say much else to them during the drive. My mom remembers my grandmother being very quiet and very nervous. Eventually, they come up to a farm. The driver tells them to wait in the car, and he goes inside the house. While he's gone, they just sit there, terrified. They're in the middle of nowhere, and they know they couldn't make it out on foot. A few minutes later, the driver comes out with a second guy who looks into the truck and sees my mom's youngest sister. He starts flipping out, screaming at the driver that he shouldn't have brought the baby back. They aren't going to do anything with her, and some other things I can't remember. He ends up telling him to get them away from the farm. The driver gets back into the truck, apologizes, and they get back on the highway and drive again in silence. My grandmother, normally a very smart woman, had him drive directly to their house. Although I suspect her reasoning was she'd already given him the address before anything seemed off. They lived at that house for several years and luckily never saw either of them a second time. My friend's dad once answered the door late one night. It was around 11 p.m. or so. At the door was an odd man asking for directions to the main road. Her dad usually works nights, but on this rare occasion, he had taken the night off. So, he tells the guy the route, and the weird dude thanked him and went off, but in the opposite direction. He'd seemed quite nervous and jittery, which is odd. But what's even weirder is he's known in the area. He'd lived there for years. He wouldn't need to ask directions to the main road. Anyway, it was revealed in the news on that same night he'd broken into a house and violently raped a woman and her daughter, and later tried to sexually assault another woman on the street, but a passerby managed to help her get away. This was after he called at my friend's house, so he'd gone there, then went off in the wrong direction and tried to rape someone. Now, my friend's family was having a lot of drama at the time. Her mother is a nutcase alcoholic and the whole street knew she'd been sent to rehab. With her dad working nights, it's likely that the weird rapey man knew my friend would be home alone.
Once, as a teenager, I was leaving a fast food drive-thru and someone in an old Bronco started to follow me. At first, I thought it was a road rage situation and did the sorry wave and tried to let him pass, but he swerved at me like he was trying to hit my car. He pulled up alongside of me and was screaming out the window, just incoherently furious, continuing to swerve at me. This was before the days of cell phones, and I was in an unfamiliar area of town. I was driving a Firebird and tried to outrun him, but he would run red lights and make crazy turns to keep up with me. Eventually, I ran into a dead end and he pulled his truck across the road to block it. There were big ditches on either side, so I was stuck. He got out and started screaming at my door handle, doors locked, and pounding on the windows. His face inches from mine, just screaming and screaming in a way that seemed he couldn't even quite see me. Shaking and crying, I turned on my overhead light so he could see I was just a teenage girl and not who he was looking for, and he jumped on my hood and started pounding and drooling in thick white smears on my windshield. I was screaming and crying and he stopped, held up one finger like, wait a minute, and scurried off to his truck. I floored the gas and ran into the ditch and drove like a crazy person for 45 minutes until I knew I had lost him. No idea what his deal was. My mom thought I made up this story to lie about the damage to my car, and still seems hesitant to believe me.
This is from a male's perspective. When my wife was in college, she took a philosophy class or something. On the first day, everyone announced who they were, etc. Turns out, she was sitting next to a police officer who was taking the class for continuing education or promotion. Can't remember, but he was actively a police officer. This was really great for her because she's small, and it was a nighttime class. They became sort of friends, as much as two people sitting next to each other for a few classes could be. He agreed to walk her to her car after class, since the school wasn't in the best area, and it made her feel safe. Around midterms, he stops showing up. She's kind of confused, but figured life happens, and something else probably came up. A few weeks later, we were at her parents' house, and her mom asks if we had heard about the police officer who had been arrested. We hadn't, so she begins to fill us in on this police officer that had been pulling women over and raping them in their cars. We live in a small town, but it gets super rural, super fast, so nobody is passing these scenes as they're happening. It turns out that the officer raping the women was the same guy that had been walking her to her car after class every week, and the reason he wasn't in class was because he had been arrested. My father was a supervisor of a now defunct inpatient mental health hospital. He supervised the children's unit. These were kids, mostly boys, that had done some terrible shit. Or they came from terrible families and through no fault of their own ended up there. One day a group outing had been planned for some kids of the unit. Two boys decided it would be a great time to start a fight right as they were about to leave. My dad decided that their behavior didn't warrant a trip. I forgot where they were going, but it was somewhere really fun. He kept them back at the facility that day. I was 6 at the time. Later that night, my dad gets a phone call from home. It's the police. Two boys had managed to slip past a psych tech sleeping on the night shift at the facility and were found just a few blocks from our house with duct tape and knives in their backpacks. Apparently, they hadn't taken kindly to being left behind and waited until they knew the night crew would be distracted doing rounds or tending to patients. They had found my dad's home address by breaking into his office and saw a picture of me on his desk. Needless to say, they confessed to my dad's face later that night that they had planned to rape and murder me. The cops had only picked them up because they were too young to be out as late as they were. My dad quit a few weeks later, and we moved across country.
This incident happened when I was in college. I was 20. I lived in a big city where I went to school, but I still used my car more than public transportation since I needed to transport a lot of materials back and forth from my apartment to campus. Sculpture major. One weeknight, I had been working late in the studio and decided to stop at the 24-hour drugstore chain on my drive home to pick up a few things, tampons and chocolate. It was pretty late, probably 2 a.m., so there wasn't any other customers in the store, but there were 2 male cashiers around my age. After I had been there 3 minutes, a new customer entered the store. He was male, late 30s, kinda jittery looking. He noticed me and started following me around the store in a really obvious way. I was trying to ignore him, get my stuff, and get out of there. He came up to me and started doing this psst noise like he was trying to discreetly get my attention. I kept ignoring him. Then he said, "Fuck you, bitch," and left the store. I figured, whatever, weirdo. As I paid for my stuff, I had this overwhelming gut feeling to ask the cashier if he wouldn't mind walking me to my car, since that jittery guy had creeped me out. The cashier said it was cool, and we make our way out to the parking lot. So I'm feeling more at ease about halfway to my car, and I turn to say thanks to the cashier for his help when he grabs my shoulder and says, "That guy is under your car." Sure enough, that fucking jittery guy was under my car. The cashier shouts, "What the fuck are you doing? I'm calling the police!" The jittery guy starts scrambling out from under my car, and cashier guy and me run back in the store, and he immediately calls the cops. It scared me pretty good. He ran away before the cops got there. I sometimes wonder what he would have done to me if I hadn't asked the cashier to walk me out. Grabbed my foot? Stabbed me with something? Just let me run him over?
This happened in Antioch, California. It was around 2 a.m. I was at a friend's house, safe in warm, sheltered suburbia. We were having a lot to drink, chit-chatting, enjoying ourselves. Of course, when you're having fun, time hits the fast-forward button, and those few minutes turn into an hour. I had too much to drink. My friend has a bit of an abrupt bedtime, so I had to dodge out early, still intoxicated. I felt too shameful thinking I'd be asking too much to stay in his house to sleep off the drunkenness. I suppose he was either too rude or too drunk to consider it himself. Whatever. Sometimes a little inconvenience makes you appreciate everything else. I needed about an hour or so to sober up and drive back. Now, as fast as time passed during my stay, it decided to drastically slow down as soon as I stepped out of his house. It was a cul-de-sac area, a concrete jungle with the stem of the street breaking into a fork. Alongside the road, my car was parked. The only streetlight that worked was in the middle of the cul-de-sac circle about 80 yards away. I stumbled toward my car, produced my keys, felt the metal line up, opened my door, and shifted to the back seat. Because this was a dark, strange, and unfamiliar neighborhood, I took the leftover newspapers and a sweater in my back seat to cover myself up. I was a little scared. I wanted to camouflage myself and not just be some guy awkwardly sitting in his car waiting for time to pass in order to drive home. I could not fall asleep. The uncomfortable feeling of a cheap backseat bed enshrouded in darkness didn't make the chance of slumber easier. It felt too ominous. And of course, my mind began to wonder. I thought of worst-case scenarios, like how the police would shine their lights on me through the window, or a drunk driver hitting my car, and... wait. In the distance, about 100 yards away, I could hear footsteps approaching. The gravel scuffed with each step forward, growing in proximity, but periodically taking stops. I wondered why until it made sense in my mind. Whoever it was probably looking through cars carefully, with the intent to steal one. I couldn't recall how many cars were on the block, but I counted 3 full stops until he was at my window, breathing. I froze. There was no more than a foot between us. The car encapsulated me as I lay hidden beneath backseat clutter, pouring myself into an object, trying my hardest to be unnoticeable, unmoving, and simply not there.
"I see you,"
said a 40-plus-year-old man in perverse baby talk. Imagine when you're playing hide and seek and one of your friends tricks you into coming out. He said it in that tone of voice, as if baiting me, like he was questioning whether the clutter in the backseat was just clutter or a person. I didn't want to move or check the window. I remained clutter. Give me an Academy Award. My body reacted by minimizing my breathing, so much so that I felt paralyzed. I dare not look. My eyes fixated on the back of the passenger seat. I didn't blink. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My heart was pounding so hard it shook my body with each throb. He circled around the car. My ears did not fail me. I heard the steps. I felt like I was part of the car. I could nearly feel him touching the trunk as he carefully pressed down on it, as if to test the alarm, as if to test me. I was in the middle of fight or flight. I couldn't do either without elevating danger. I was frozen and hoping to God he was bluffing. He circled the car again. The door handle to my right jiggled. He was pulling it multiple times.
"I see you."
Same tone, but more agitated and stressed. More convinced that he was trying to make that clutter move, revealing itself to be of his expectations that it was me. My muscles tensed like a cow before slaughter. That sound had to be metal against glass. Take a penny right now and tap on your window. A crowbar, a knife, a rock, a gun. My eyes fixated on the seat in front of me, never averting my gaze, like he was. I was covered enough to where I couldn't see beyond the seat in front of me. I know I couldn't see him, but I could feel his eyes resting on top of me.
"My name is Poker Face. What's your name?"
The voice changed in a lower, demented, and serious tone. My mind forced a visual, and it wasn't anything human. I already accepted my death. I was ready to be shot in the head, take a life-changing bullet, multiple knife wounds, just make this sleep bearable, not excruciating as you drain me of life. I wouldn't know how to react. My thoughts grew dimmer. I imagined my friend waking up the next morning after a calm night of safe and sound sleep, only to discover my mutilated, defiled, and bloodied body hanging outside my car door. It was then that I heard nothing but my own heart. What was this person doing now, just staring at me in the middle of the night? Talking to me or a messy pile in the back seat? Time froze. The footsteps were being swallowed into the distance. Thank God he left. I waited another hour until the sun showed itself. I jumped in the front seat and bolted out of there, wide-eyed and very sober. Have you ever had a close call? Have you ever had that sinking feeling if you had turned left instead of right, you might be on a milk carton? If so, please contact me through any of my social media links. See you next time.